In the last week of August, 1944, on the dust-choked roads of northern France, the German army was running out of time and space. The Falaise Pocket had just collapsed. Tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers were marching west into Allied prisoner-of-war cages. The interrogations that followed have been preserved in the Foreign Military Studies series and the European Theatre Historical Interrogations file, two great archives of post-war German testimony held by the United States Army Historical Division. One theme appears across them again and again. German officers, even seasoned staff officers from Corps and Army headquarters, could not understand the speed at which the American heavy guns were moving. What they were describing in those interrogations did not match anything in their training, their manuals, or their model of how a modern army was supposed to work. Long columns of American tracked vehicles, moving at a steady, almost casual pace, each vehicle towing a cannon, not a small cannon, a long, slender barrel pointed past the cab like a lance. Behind those, shorter, fatter barrels mounted on enormous split-trail carriages. Behind those, trucks, and still more trucks, loaded with shells and powder bags and crewmen sitting on canvas seats with their helmets in their laps. No horses, no broken-down half-tracks abandoned at the roadside, no exhausted gun crews pushing carriages by hand, just heavy artillery battalions moving on their own power, in daylight, as if there were no war on at all. American intelligence officers later recalled that one of the questions they heard most often from their German prisoners, in different forms and in different words, came down to a single bewildered theme. Where are the horses? The number that those officers reached, when the answers were finally pieced together, did not match any German staff calculation. It was a number that, when later reported back to surviving higher headquarters, was met with disbelief. Under favorable conditions, according to the United States Army's own field artillery doctrine, an American heavy artillery battalion could road march up to 160 miles in a single day. This is the story of how that became possible. The long-barreled gun with the slender muzzle, the one most often referenced in those post-war accounts, was almost certainly the 155mm gun M1, known across the United States Army by the same nickname its First World War predecessor had carried, the Long Tom. It fired a 100-pound high-explosive shell to a maximum range of about 14 miles. In firing position, it weighed about 30,600 pounds. The shorter, fatter barrels behind it were the 8-inch howitzer M1, a weapon famous within the United States Army for being one of the most accurate guns ever fielded by any nation in the Second World War. It threw a 200-pound shell out to 10.5 miles, and gun crews used to joke that you could drop one of its rounds inside a circle the size of a tennis court at maximum range. There was a third weapon, not in that particular column, but waiting further back in the Corps artillery park. A monster. The 240mm howitzer M1, nicknamed by its crews the Black Dragon. It fired a 360-pound shell out to 23,000 meters, more than 14 miles. In firing position, it weighed 64,700 pounds. To move it from one firing site to another required two prime movers, one for the carriage, one for the barrel, plus a 20-ton mobile crane to assemble the two pieces back together once they reached the new position. Emplacement could take up to 8 hours of careful work by a 14-man crew. And yet, despite all of that, the Black Dragon could be on a new gun line, dug in, surveyed, registered, and ready to fire, in less than a single day after receiving the order to move. The fourth piece in this family was the 8-inch gun M1, sharing the same massive carriage as the 240mm howitzer. It fired a 240-pound shell to a range of just over 32,000 meters, 20 miles. That made it, by a comfortable margin, the longest-ranged field artillery weapon in United States Army service in the entire war. These guns were not ornaments. They were not parade pieces. They were corps-level weapons, held above the division and assigned where the fighting was hardest. By the spring of 1945, 33 of the Long Tom battalions were in Europe and the Mediterranean. About 40 of the 8-inch howitzer battalions were on the Western Front. About 13 of the Black Dragon battalions were active in the European theatre. Together, they could pour shells into German positions at a weight, a rate, and a precision that the Wehrmacht could not match anywhere on any front. But the guns themselves were not the secret. Other armies had heavy guns. The French had them, the British had them, the Soviets had them, the Germans had them. What no other army on earth had, in 1944 was the answer to a much harder question. How do you move them? To understand why the question of movement mattered so much, you have to understand what the rest of the war looked like. By the summer of 1944, the Second World War was a different war than the one Germany had started. The Blitzkrieg of 1939 and 1940 was a memory. The vast Eastern Front had ground down dozens of German divisions and chewed up hundreds of thousands of horses. North Africa had been lost. Italy had become a slow, bleeding sore from Salerno to Cassino. And then, on June 6, 1944, the Western Allies had landed in Normandy. For nearly 2 months after that landing, the Allies had been pinned in the Bocage country, a maze of sunken lanes and impossibly thick hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress. Casualties were brutal. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards. To German commanders, looking at their situation maps, the front in France looked stable, almost manageable, despite the relentless American artillery fire and the constant overhead drone of fighter bombers. That was the Wehrmacht's last comfortable mistake. What the German command did not see, and could not see, was the vast machinery being assembled behind the front, not just tanks, not just infantry divisions. The motorized backbone of an army that, unlike their own, did not run on hay. Because here is one of the great myths of the Second World War. The German army was not a marvel of mechanical efficiency. By November 1944, of 264 German combat divisions on the order of battle, only 42 were armoured or motorized. The other 222 moved on hooves and feet. Roughly 75 to 85% of the Wehrmacht relied on horses for transport throughout the entire war. A standard German infantry division in 1944 had about 4,600 horses on its strength. It also had 1,400 horse-drawn vehicles. In total, across the war, the German army at any given moment had approximately 1.1 million horses in service. They ate, they got sick, they died, they had to be replaced, and they limited every march to the speed of an animal hauling a load on a dirt road. The American army, by contrast, had been built from the ground up around the internal combustion engine. The United States produced more than 2.4 million tactical trucks during the war. It produced, in West Allis, Wisconsin, a vehicle called the M4 high-speed tractor. Alice Chalmers built 5,552 of them between March 1943 and June 1945. It was an 18-ton tracked vehicle with a Waukesha 6-cylinder gasoline engine that produced 190 horsepower at full rated speed. It carried 125 gallons of fuel. Its operational range on a single tank, depending on terrain and load, was somewhere between 100 and 180 miles. Its top road speed was 33 to 35 miles per hour, with a long tom or an 8-inch howitzer hooked to its tow pintle. It carried a crew of 11 gunners in its open rear bay, sitting on canvas-covered seats with their rifles in racks and a coil of camouflage netting strapped to the side. There was a smaller cousin, the M5 high-speed tractor, which towed the medium calibers like the 105mm and the 4.5-inch. There was a much larger cousin, the M6 high-speed tractor, a 38-ton machine driven by 2 of those same Waukesha engines mounted side by side. The M6 was built to tow the Black Dragon and the 8-inch gun M1, the 2 pieces that no other vehicle on Earth could pull. Alice Chalmers built 1,235 of those. For the long tom and the 8-inch howitzer, there was also a wheeled prime mover, the Mack NO 7.5-ton 6x6. About 2,050 of these were built between 1943 and 1945. The Mack had a 6-cylinder gasoline engine of nearly 12 litres, 159 horsepower, a 40,000-pound winch on the front, and the ability to tow a load of 50,000 pounds on a paved road at 32 miles per hour. There were heavier tractors still, the Diamond T980 and the Diamond T981, more than 6,000 built. The Hercules diesel engine, 185 horsepower, used to haul tank transporter trailers and as a ballast truck for the heaviest gun moves. And then there was the truly novel thing, the American self-propelled heavy gun. The M12 gun motor carriage was the first of its kind in any army. It mounted an old Great War vintage 155mm gun on the chassis of an M3 Lee tank. Only 100 were built, and only 74 were issued for combat. They equipped 6 battalions, the 258th, the 557th, the 558th, the 987th, the 989th, and the 991st Field Artillery Battalions. Crews nicknamed them King Kong and Doorknocker. Their job, very specifically, was to drive up to a German bunker on the Siegfried Line, plant the spade, level the gun over open sights, and put 155mm shells through 3 feet of reinforced concrete from a range that the bunker garrison could not believe. When the M12 was retired, its replacement was the M40 gun motor carriage, which mounted the new long tom on the chassis of an M4A3 Sherman. About 311 were built before the war's end, between January and May 1945. Only 2 pilot vehicles saw combat in the Second World War, an M40 prototype and a sister T-89 vehicle temporarily fitted with a 155mm gun, both engaged at the Battle of Cologne in March 1945, with the 991st Field Artillery Battalion. The rest of the production run would go to Korea and serve as the most effective long-range American self-propelled artillery weapon of that later war. So that was what the American heavy artillery park looked like on the roads of Normandy and Lorraine in the summer of 1944. Not just guns. A complete, integrated, motorized system with purpose-built tractors, purpose-built trucks, purpose-built crane trucks, purpose-built ammunition carriers, and purpose-built self-propelled mountings. A system, a machine. To compare that to what the Wehrmacht could field is almost painful. The German equivalent of the M6 high-speed tractor, in concept, was the Schwerer Zugkraftwagen 18-ton, designation SDKFZ-9, nicknamed by its crews the FAMO. It had a Maybach 12-cylinder engine of 270 horsepower. It was, by any reasonable standard, a fine vehicle. FAMO and Wehrmacht and Tatra built about 2,500 of them, between 1938 and 1945. That is less than half the production run of the M4 high-speed tractor alone. It was so scarce that 2 and sometimes 4 FAMOs were required to recover a single Tiger or Panther tank from a battlefield, and the demand for tank recovery work meant that the artillery rarely got to keep them. The lighter SDKFZ-7, an 8-ton half-track, towed the 88mm flak gun and the 15cm howitzer. Production was higher, around 12,000, but there were never enough for the gun fleet they were supposed to move. For the heaviest weapons, there was nothing. The German super-heavy artillery did not road march. It rode the rails, or it walked at the pace of a man. Consider the Karl Gerrit, the 60cm and 54cm self-propelled mortar, of which only 7 were ever built, 6 combat weapons and 1 test vehicle. It weighed 124 tons. Its top speed under its own power was 6 1/5 miles per hour. To move it any operational distance, the entire vehicle had to be broken into 7 separate loads and shipped by railway flat car or by a special trailer pulled behind multiple tractors. If the bridges along the route could not bear the combined weight of trailer plus mortar, the mortar had to be unloaded and driven across the bridge separately, then reloaded on the other side. Consider the K5 railway gun, a 28cm weapon. The German crews who served the 2 K5s that bombarded the Anzio beachhead in 1944 named their guns Robert and Leopold. American troops on the beach, hearing the shells come in but never seeing the gun, gave the unseen weapon 2 nicknames of their own, Anzio Annie and Anzio Express. Both K5s were eventually captured. Each one was bound to its rails. Each one rolled out of a tunnel, fired, and rolled back into the tunnel before counter-battery fire could find it. Consider the 80cm Schwerer Gustav, the largest cannon ever fielded in combat by any nation. It could not move at all without first laying its own twin set of railway track. Bringing it into firing position required up to 4,000 men working over several weeks. This was the contrast. Not just 2 guns of similar caliber compared side by side, but 2 entire philosophies of warfare. One side built heavy artillery that could keep up with a fast-moving front. The other side built heavy artillery that the front had to wait for. And the Americans had built something else, too. Something invisible. Something that lived in the radio waves and the slide rules and the gridded maps of the firing batteries. They had built the fire direction center, and along with it, the technique called time on target. It is impossible to overstate how revolutionary the fire direction center was. Before its development at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the late 1930s, artillery worked battery by battery. A forward observer called for fire from one battery. That battery's officers calculated the firing data. The guns fired. If you wanted more guns on the target, you had to call them in one at a time, with a separate fire mission for each. It was slow. It scattered the impact across minutes. It gave the enemy time to take cover. The American innovation was to centralize all of that calculation in one place per battalion, called the Fire Direction Center. A forward observer, watching a German tank column emerge from a tree line, would speak into his radio handset and report the target by grid coordinate. The Fire Direction Center would compute the firing data simultaneously for every battery in range. By radio, on a network that could include batteries from a sister battalion, from a regiment, from an entire division, even from corps-level reinforcements, the orders went out. Each battery worked out its own time of flight, the exact number of seconds its shells would spend in the air before reaching the target. Each battery received a countdown, and every shell from every battery struck the target at the same instant. The technique was called time on target. Crews shortened it to TOT. In a single 90-second burst, you could put the weight of an entire division's artillery, or an entire corps' artillery, on a single grid square. 200 guns, 800 shells, all landing simultaneously, with no warning whatsoever for the men on the receiving end. German prisoners interrogated after these strikes consistently described what had happened to them as a flak barrage from the ground. They had no equivalent in their own doctrine. They had nothing in their training that prepared them for 100 shells arriving at once with no preliminary ranging shots, no walking fire, no creeping barrage, just a sudden eruption of high explosive across hundreds of yards of front in less than a single breath. In the fight for Hill 192 outside St. Lo, in July 1944, the United States 2nd Infantry Division's artillery support reached densities that German prisoners afterward called unprecedented. 8 battalions of guns fired tens of thousands of rounds in support of the assault that finally took the hill on July 11. The Corps commander could, if he chose to, mass the equivalent of 4 battalions of medium and heavy guns onto a single coordinate within 9 minutes of receiving a request. There was one more piece, and it was perhaps the deadliest of them all. In December 1944, after years of secret development at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, the United States introduced into European ground combat a small device called the VT fuze, also code-named POSIT. It was, in essence, a tiny radio transmitter and receiver built into the nose of an artillery shell. As the shell flew, it broadcast a continuous radio signal. When that signal bounced back off the ground, off a tree, off a vehicle, or off the men below in a strong enough echo, the fuse detonated the shell at the optimal height for fragmentation, about 20 meters, right above the heads of the target. Before the VT fuse, getting a shell to airburst required the gunner to know the precise altitude of the impact zone and to set a mechanical time fuse to the exact second of flight. It was an art. With the VT fuse, every shell airburst, automatically, without calculation, against any target. Open infantry. Vehicles in the open. Men crouched in the bottoms of foxholes that, until that moment, had been safe from anything except a direct hit. The first authorized ground combat use of the VT fuse in Europe came in the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge. American artillery began firing the new fuse against German troops on or about December 16, 1944, the very day the Ardennes attack began. The first such use, by Colonel George Axelson's 406th Artillery Group supporting the 38th Cavalry Squadron at Monschau, came before General Eisenhower's formal request to lift the long-standing security embargo 3 days later. By December 21, the embargo was gone, and the fuse was free to be used everywhere on the front. A particularly devastating use came in the dawn hours near Echternach in Luxembourg, when 3rd Army Artillery cut down a German infantry battalion of the 212th Volksgrenadier Division, attempting to cross open ground along the Sauer River. General George Patton wrote about that action within days in a letter to Major General Levin Campbell, the Chief of Army Ordnance. Patton would later say, in his own account of the war, that the funny fuse, as he liked to call it, won the Battle of the Bulge for him. He was glad, he told Campbell, that American ordnance had thought of it first. Approximately 200,000 VT fused shells were fired by American artillery during the Battle of the Bulge. The result on German infantry attacks was apocalyptic. So this was the American heavy artillery system on the eve of the breakout from Normandy. Purpose-built tractors that could march a battalion 160 miles in a day. A fire direction system that could mass a corps' worth of guns on a single coordinate in 9 minutes. A new fuse that turned every shell into an airburst. And a doctrine, taught at Fort Sill since the late 1930s, that valued the speed of the call for fire above almost everything else. What it would do to the German army when finally turned loose, almost no one in Berlin had any imagination for. The breaking point came on July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra. The American First Army, under Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, planned to crack open the German line west of St. Lo with a single, concentrated, massive blow. The plan called for 1,581 heavy bombers, of which 1,503 would actually drop, plus about 600 fighter bombers in the opening wave, plus a third wave of medium bombers, plus 1,100 American artillery pieces, all concentrated on a target box 6 kilometers wide and 2 kilometers deep. The German unit holding that ground was Panzer Lehr Division, one of the most experienced armoured divisions in the Wehrmacht, commanded by Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein. Bayerlein survived the day. After the war, in his interrogation manuscripts written for American historians, he described what had happened to his command in words that have since become some of the most famous testimony of the Western Front campaign. "The bombers came as if on a conveyor belt," he wrote. "Back and forth the carpets were laid. Artillery positions were wiped out, tanks overturned and buried, infantry positions flattened, and all roads and tracks destroyed. All signal communications had been cut, and no command was possible. The shock effect on the troops was indescribable. Simultaneously with the storm from the air, innumerable guns of American artillery pounded drum fire into our positions. Over 70% of my soldiers," he claimed, "were either dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed." Modern operational research has argued that Bayerlein's casualty figure was, like many of his post-war statements, somewhat exaggerated. His division had been under strength before the bombardment began. Even so, Panzer Lehr lost more than 1,000 men and most of its remaining armour in a single morning. By his own post-war accounting, roughly half of those losses came from the bombing and roughly 30% from the American artillery. The remaining 20% he attributed to ground combat after the curtain lifted. Leslie McNair, the lieutenant general who had been the chief of Army Ground Forces and the man more responsible than any other for the fully motorized American artillery branch, was killed by a short bomb that fell into a forward trench he was visiting that day. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre of the war. But Cobra worked. Panzer Lehr was finished as a coherent fighting unit. The German line west of St. Lo cracked. The American 12th Army Group's left flank was now wide open and pointing east, and the man Bradley chose to drive through that opening was Lieutenant General George Patton, commander of the newly activated American Third Army. What happened next over the following 4 weeks is one of the most extraordinary operational achievements in the history of mechanized warfare. Third Army covered approximately 400 miles from the Normandy beaches to the banks of the Moselle River in less than a single month. Divisions raced ahead of their own supply lines. The towed Long Toms and 8-inch howitzers and Black Dragons of the Corps artillery battalions did exactly what their planners at Fort Sill had said they could do. They moved with the front. They displaced from one fire mission to the next at the speed of their tractors and trucks. They did not stop. A road march in those weeks was its own small world. The order would come down from Corps headquarters in the late afternoon. The battalion commander would gather his battery officers, point at a map, and trace a route. The senior gunnery sergeant would walk the line of guns with a clipboard, checking that each carriage was hooked properly to its prime mover, that the recoil locks were engaged, that the muzzle covers were cinched down. Drivers checked oil and coolant. Crews stripped their canvas seats out of the rear bays of the M4 tractors and stuffed them with spare blankets and rolled rain ponchos to make the ride less brutal on a hard wooden bench at 30 miles per hour. The kitchen truck loaded loaves of bread and cans of stew. The fuel truck topped off every tank. The march began at last light, when the German fighters and reconnaissance aircraft, what was left of them, would be landing for the night. Headlights blacked out for the first hour, then unblacked as the column moved further from any possible observation. A typical heavy battalion strung out across nearly 2 miles of road, 12 guns, 12 prime movers, 24 ammunition trucks loaded to capacity, fuel trucks, fire direction half-tracks, kitchen and supply trucks, and a service battery with welders and mechanics and spare parts. Halts came every 2 hours. Crews dismounted, walked stiffly along the line, and greased the bogie wheels of the tractors. The 8 rubber tires on the carriage of the Long Tom were notorious for heating on long runs, and a sergeant would walk down the gun line with his bare hand, touching each tire to feel for the one that had run hot. If a tire was bad, the carriage came off the road, and the gun was fixed where it stood while the rest of the column moved on. Field artillery battalions earned reputations for their pace. The 740th, the 264th, and the 174th all left after action records of long single-day road marches in August 1944. The 991st, with its M12 gun motor carriages, did its own version of the same trick at the Siegfried Line, driving up to bunkers, firing at point-blank range, and displacing before German counter-battery fire could find them. The 697th and 698th, the first 2 Black Dragon battalions in combat, fired their massive shells against the K5 railway gun above the Anzio beachhead in January 1944, and proved, weeks before the rest of the European theatre knew the answer, that an American heavy battalion could displace overnight while a German railway gun could not. There is a moment in this race that captured everything. The German counterattack at Mortain, code-named Operation Lüttich, beginning on August 7, 1944. Adolf Hitler personally ordered a force of 4 panzer divisions and elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division to drive west to the sea at Avranches, cut Patton's army off from its supplies, and reverse the Normandy breakout. The German XLVI Panzer Corps, including 2nd Panzer, 116th Panzer, 1st SS Panzer, 2nd SS Panzer, and the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier, attacked into the American 30th Infantry Division's positions in the dark. Within hours, 2 infantry battalions from the 120th Infantry Regiment were cut off on a hill above the town of Mortain. Hill 314. There were about 700 Americans on that hill. They had 1 fading radio. They were surrounded on all sides by German armour, and they had 2 artillery forward observers with them. 2nd Lieutenant Robert Weiss and 1st Lieutenant Charles Bartz of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion. Through that 1 fading radio, those 2 men called fire from a half-dozen American artillery battalions onto the German formations attacking them, and at peak, with corps and division reinforcements added, as many as a dozen battalions of guns were firing in support of Hill 314. Their shells fell sometimes within yards of the men calling for them. They held that hill for 6 days. When the 230th's own ammunition trucks could not get through, and the men on the hill ran out of food and medical supplies, the artillerymen down below loaded medical supply canisters into their own gun tubes and fired the canisters up onto the hilltop using calculated charges and elevations. It worked. Mortain broke the German counterattack. By the time it ended, the German force trying to reach Avranches had been stopped, badly mauled, and forced into the Falaise Pocket, along with the rest of Army Group B in Normandy. About 300 American casualties on Hill, 314 out of 700, but the hill held, and the road east stayed open. The Falaise Pocket itself, between August 12 and August 21, is what Eisenhower described as scenes that could be described only by Dante. German losses inside the pocket included between 10,000 and 15,000 killed, between 40,000 and 50,000 prisoners, more than 300 tanks, 2,500 vehicles, and 250 artillery pieces destroyed. Bayerlein, looking back on it after the war, wrote that not even the battles of annihilation of the 1940 Blitzkrieg in France or the 1941 drive in Russia could approach the Battle of Annihilation in France in 1944 in the magnitude of their collector. Planning, the logic of their execution, the collaboration of sea, air, and ground forces, the size of the theatre, the strength of the combatants, the bulk of the booty, or the hordes of prisoners. He was talking, in part, about the artillery. The race continued. By the end of August, Third Army had reached the Moselle. Patton wrote in his diary on August 14 that Third Army had advanced further and faster than any army in history. To keep him supplied, the Americans organized the Red Ball Express, a one-way truck convoy system conceived in late August and beginning operations on August 25, 1944. At its peak, 6,000 trucks carried more than 12,000 tons of supplies in a single day. Roughly 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers. The Red Ball Express ran for 82 days, until the middle of November. By the autumn, the front had stabilized along the German border, the Siegfried Line, and the Great Rivers. The fighting in Aachen, in the Hürtgen forest on the Ruhr, was a slow, grinding, costly business. The Black Dragons came forward to deal with the bunkers of the West Wall. M12 gun motor carriages drove up to within a few hundred yards of pillboxes and put 155mm shells directly through the embrasures. Then came December 16, 1944, the German Ardennes counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had assembled, in conditions of extraordinary secrecy, a force of more than 200,000 men in three armies, the 6th SS Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army, and the 7th Army, to drive through the lightly defended Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and capture the supply port of Antwerp. The attack achieved complete surprise. Within days, an entire American Infantry Division had collapsed, and a salient 60 miles deep had been driven into the American line. The town of Bastogne, a key crossroads, was surrounded. In the Situation Room at Verdun on December 19, 1944, Eisenhower asked his army commanders what they could do. Patton's reply, recorded by his aide Colonel Charles Codman and preserved in his own war memoir, was that he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. Eisenhower told him to take 3 days to gather his strength and to attack on the morning of December 22 with a strong initial blow. The other officers in the room fell silent. There was a stir, a shuffling of feet. Most of them did not believe him. Patton kept his promise. Over the following 72 hours, he pulled 3 divisions, plus the Corps artillery battalions of the 3rd Army's 3rd Corps and 12th Corps, out of an active battle line facing east toward the Saar, turned them 90 degrees north, and sent them roughly 100 miles up roads coated in ice and snow under a blackout that almost everyone violated, racing to the relief of Bastogne. Communication teams laid thousands of miles of new telephone wire to keep the new front talking to itself. The long toms and 8-inch howitzers did not lag. They marched at the speed of their tractors. On December 26, 1944, the 4th Armoured Division broke the encirclement of Bastogne when 1st Lieutenant Charles Bulge of C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, made first contact with the encircled garrison's engineers at about 10 minutes before 5 in the afternoon. By the end of January 1945, the Bulge was gone. The German army that had attacked through the Ardennes was destroyed. It had been broken not by a single weapon but by a system. Mobility, mass, and accuracy, all delivered by an artillery branch that, as the historian Michael Doubler argues in his book Closing with the Enemy, had by the summer of 1944 proven itself the most effective performer in the American Combined Arms team. Of course, in the days and weeks immediately after Cobra, after Mortain, after the Falaise Pocket, the German General Staff wanted to know how. How could an army move heavy guns this fast? How could an army deliver fires of this weight on coordinates with no preliminary registration? How could an army shoot night after night in densities that the Wehrmacht's own artillery, even at full strength, could not match? Several of the surviving German commanders left their answers in the post-war interrogation series compiled by the United States Army Historical Division. The series ran into the hundreds of manuscripts, identified by codes like ETHINT and MS, conducted with senior German officers, held at the Allendorf and Neustadt detention centers between 1945 and the early 1950s. Major General Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, the Chief of Staff to General Hermann Balck and one of the sharpest staff officers in the Wehrmacht, recorded an exchange with an emissary from Heinz Guderian himself in November 1944. Guderian had sent the emissary forward with what Mellenthin described as gratuitous advice on how to employ artillery. Mellenthin's response was blunt. Our problem that late in the war, he said, was not how to employ artillery. Our problem was where to get the guns and the ammunition. We were critically short of everything. For this impertinence, Guderian had Mellenthin briefly placed under house arrest. Mellenthin was, in his view, only stating the obvious. General Gunther Blumentritt, the Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt for most of 1944, devoted long sections of his post-war foreign military studies manuscripts to the effectiveness of the American artillery branch on the Western Front. He named Patton, in his own words, as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action. The American time-on-target technique, in those manuscripts and in many others by other German officers, was singled out repeatedly as something for which the Wehrmacht had no organizational answer. His successor as Rundstedt's Chief of Staff, General Siegfried Westphal, made similar observations in the English-language edition of his memoir, The German Army in the West, published in 1951, after his release from Allied custody. Westphal had served in North Africa under Rommel, in Italy under Kesselring, and in the West under Rundstedt. He had seen the British artillery, the American artillery, and the Soviet artillery from the receiving end. He concluded that the American system, the combination of mobility and centralized fire control, was the most effective ground-based weapon his side had faced in the entire war. Field Marshal Rundstedt himself, in post-war interrogations conducted by American officers between 1945 and 1946, returned again and again to American material superiority as the irresistible factor that had driven the German army out of France. The artillery, he said, was the worst of it. Out of the thousands of pages of these interrogations, a single statement is sometimes quoted in popular books. American artillery is worth 2 divisions. No single named German general can be conclusively documented as the speaker of that exact sentence in that exact form. It appears instead to be a paraphrase of a consensus drawn from many separate prisoner-of-war interrogations across the front. The historian Robert Rush, in a 1999 analysis of the German 74th Corps published in the journal Armed Forces and Society, found that respect for Allied artillery appeared near the top of nearly every German prisoner interrogation summary, alongside fear of fighter bombers. The two threats were nearly always paired together. The American artillerymen knew the effect they were having. On the front line, nothing was ever simple, but the consensus among the infantry commanders they supported was clear. Major General Raymond Barton, commanding the 4th Infantry Division through the Hurtgen Forest, told visiting reporters that the Germans were holding on by the guts of their soldiers alone, because by his count the Americans outnumbered them 10-1 in infantry, 50-1 in artillery, and by an infinite number in the air. Patton himself, addressing his artillery officers after the war in remarks long associated with the Field Artillery Journal and with the United States Army Field Artillery Museum, said it more bluntly. "I do not have to tell you who won the war," he is quoted as saying. "You know, the artillery did." After the war, the towed Long Tom was redesignated the M59 during the Korean War era reorganization. The 8-inch howitzer was redesignated the M115 in 1962. Both served through the Korean War and into the Vietnam War. Some of the Black Dragons went to Taiwan and were dug into fixed bunkers on Kinmen and Matsu, where they remained operational deep into the 21st century. The M40 gun motor carriage, which had only seen 2 pilot vehicles engaged in combat in the Second World War, became the principal long-range American self-propelled gun of the Korean War. The doctrinal innovations endured even longer. The Fire Direction Center, the time-on-target technique, and the proximity fuze, as a triad, became the foundation of NATO field artillery doctrine through the 1980s. The digital fire control systems used today on the M270 multiple launch rocket system and the high-mobility artillery rocket system are, in their underlying logic, direct descendants of the manual fire direction center procedures worked out at Fort Sill in the late 1930s. The vehicles themselves are mostly gone. A handful survive. The single remaining M12 gun motor carriage, named by its crew Adolph's Assassin, and originally serving with a battery of the 991st Field Artillery Battalion, is on display at the United States Army Field Artillery Museum at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where it was moved in November 2010 from the older Aberdeen Proving Ground collection. A few Long Toms, a few 8-inch howitzers, a few Black Dragons, a small number of M40s, and 1 or 2 intact M4 high-speed tractors survive in museum collections in the United States and Europe. The men are mostly gone too. The young soldiers who rode in the open beds of those tractors, 11 to a vehicle, with their rifles in racks and their helmets in their laps, and who stepped down at midnight onto a French country road to crank a gun into firing position by lantern light, have grown old and passed away. The forward observers, who, like Robert Weiss and Charles Bartz on Hill 314, called multiple battalions of fire onto German tank columns and held a position they were not supposed to hold, are mostly gone. The fire direction officers who built grids on plotting boards in canvas tents under a single bulb hung from a tent pole are mostly gone. What is left is the record. The unit histories, the after-action reports, the interrogation manuscripts, the green books of the United States Army Center of Military History, the surviving guns at Fort Sill and Aberdeen, and the testimony of generals on both sides who agreed, with no equivocation, on what the American artillery had done. By the late summer of 1944, captured German officers, interrogated by American intelligence sections in France, were repeatedly recording, in different words and different forms, the same astonishment. There was no vocabulary in their training for what they were seeing. Their manuals did not cover it. The machines passing on the roads were towing weapons that, on their side of the line, would have required hours of preparation, miles of railway track, and thousands of men working over several weeks just to bring into action. The Americans were doing it on rubber tires and steel tracks at 30 miles per hour, in columns that did not stop. They could be forgiven for not believing what they were seeing. Almost no officer in the Wehrmacht, looking at the same kind of column, would have believed it either. Their entire war-making system rested on a different bet. A bet that a smaller, faster, more skillful army could outmaneuver a larger, slower, less imaginative one. It was a bet that had paid off, again and again, through Poland and France and the Low Countries and the Balkans and the long, terrible push into Russia. In 1944, on the roads of Normandy and Lorraine, that bet ran into something the German General Staff had not built a model for, an army that did not have to choose between weight and speed, an army where the heavy guns moved at the same pace as the tanks, an army where the question how you move the cannons had been answered, methodically, in factories in Wisconsin and Illinois and Michigan, years before anyone fired the first shot. The number that came out of that answer was 160 miles in a single day. It was a planning figure. It was a doctrinal capability published by the United States Army's own field artillery school. It was, in the rapid pursuits of August 1944, and again in the December race to Bastogne, a capability that the heavy battalions came close to fulfilling on more than one occasion. And it was, for the German command, simply impossible to absorb, because they were still moving on horseback. If you had told a German staff officer in 1939 that the war was going to be decided not by tanks, not by aircraft, not by submarines, but by the question of whether your heavy artillery could keep up with your front, he would have laughed. Heavy artillery did not keep up with the front. Heavy artillery arrived a week after the front, by rail, and then waited at the rear while the Panzer divisions did the hard work. But the men at Fort Sill, in the late 1930s, had seen something different. They had seen, in their training exercises and their war games, that a battle could be won by a well-sighted battery firing the right shells at the right moment, even against a numerically superior enemy. And they had asked the right question. If the right shells at the right moment could win the battle, then the most important property of the artillery branch, more important even than its caliber or its range, was the speed at which it could be there. That answer is why a battalion of 155mm long toms, 12 guns and their tractors and their ammunition trucks and their fire direction half-tracks and their service battery could leave a firing position at dawn on one road, march most of the way across northern France on another road, register a new firing position before sunset, and be ready to put a corps-level time on target onto a German position by nightfall. It is why the men in Bastogne could be reached, in a winter battle that the German command thought they had won, by an army that had been 100 miles away 3 days earlier. It is why the German officers whose voices fill the post-war interrogation files could not, in retrospect, believe what they had been up against. Because what they had been up against was not just a column of guns. It was an answer to the wrong question. The question their side had been asking for years was how to make the perfect weapon. The question the Americans had been asking, and quietly answering since the late 1930s, was how to make the perfect system. The system won. The story of that system, of the M4 high-speed tractor and the Mack NO and the M6 and the Long Tom and the Black Dragon and the Fire Direction Center and the Time on Target and the VT Fuze, is the story of how an army that was supposedly less aggressive, less professional, and less experienced than the Wehrmacht came onto the European continent and rolled forward, day after day, mile after mile, for 11 months, from Normandy to the Elbe, at a pace its enemies could not match and could not understand. That is why the number 160 miles a day matters, not as a record, not as a stunt, but as a measurement of something the United States Army's ordnance officers, field artillery officers, motor transport officers, and industrial planners had been building, deliberately, for almost a decade before the war began. They built it because they had asked, before anyone shot at them, the simplest possible question about war. How fast can the guns move? And then they answered it.